All right, so we do have a file to download today, university crime data. It's part of that same data set that we first started looking at yesterday, or I should say the last time we were together. And so let's go ahead and get that downloaded. And our content for today is working with pivot tables. When I first started teaching this content in VBA, maybe 10% of the students were comfortable with pivot tables. But if I was to ask, in fact, I will just go ahead and ask you to show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how comfortable you are with pivot tables. 5, really comfortable. 0, never heard of them. So looks like we have, so most folks are 3, 4, or 5 on that. So it's not so much today about working with pivot tables as it is automating and understanding the objects that we use in VBA to work with pivot tables. So let's go ahead and take a look at our database that we're going to be working with. And I thought I opened that file. University crime, oh, here it is. Okay, so university crime data. So this is actually data that's really similar to the format that you're going to be putting this data into in the database. So coming up is the database modification project. And so we've got data that looks like this coming in from the FBI's crimes known to law enforcement data set. And ultimately, we're going to get that data into this format. So in fact, this is actually just a dump of the data table that you'll be working with in that database modification assignment. Now, the thing that seems a little bit strange about this is that each one of these rows really is information only about one piece of data. So right here, that number right there, 5128, everything else in this row just gives context to that number. So that's enrollment on the Montgomery campus of Auburn University in the state of Alabama in the year 2006. And that's enrollment is not a crime, it's just informational. Then we have 8 crime numbers from that same city or that same state school campus year. Looks like Auburn's a pretty safe place to be. 5,000 students, and the only crimes reported there, at least, are 8 counts of larceny. So just to kind of realize, kind of in the back of your mind, that this is what we're going to end up doing in that database modification project, is saying, hey, I've got to take that number, give it its context, so the campus, the college, the state, the year, and then add a record for that number into the database, a number for this data into the database, and so forth. But anyway, the point is, it's the same data. So working with this data, in addition to learning about pivot tables, is helping us to get a little bit more comfort level working with our database modification project. And as I mentioned, that's the project that is students generally agree upon is the most difficult one of the term. Okay, so let's just go ahead and make a pivot table to allow us to kind of play around and look at this data. So I'm going to go ahead and what we'll do is we're going to build a pivot table together once, and then I'll delete the pivot table, and we will record ourselves creating the pivot table so we get the code that it takes, and then we'll go ahead and modify it. Some things requires very little modification. Pivot tables are going to require some heavy modification to really get the code to where it's a state that's reusable. So let's just go ahead and come to the Insert tab, and Pivot Table is the very first button. Insert a pivot table. Whoops. Make sure I only have one cell selected inside my data range, and it'll expand to take up all the data. So Pivot Table, and I'll put it on a new worksheet. That looks great. Okay, so what I'd like to do is that value, that last column called value, is the numbers that we're going to want to summarize. And so that's definitely going to be the value that we're putting into our pivot table. So I'm just going to drag value down here into the values segment of the pivot table. Oh, that's a great number. What is that, 3 million? 30 million? What does that number mean? And maybe another question is, does that number mean anything? No, it's the sum of that column. You've got crimes and you've got student enrollment all mixed in. It doesn't, that's a meaningless number. So let's give some context to it. So instead of having just that number summarized, let me go ahead and at least bring the label down as my row identifier. So this looks better. So what does that number mean right there? Like this is, kind of not a trick question. Some data analysis, go ahead. Yeah, that's the total number of arson incidents we have reported in the data set. Excellent. The whole point for a pivot table is to allow us to, and so in this case, we've summarized the data along one dimension. We've said we've got this value number over here, and we want to split that up along this dimension that's called it's called label, but it's basically just what the raw what that number is representing. But pivot tables allow us to see multiple dimensions simultaneously. So let's go ahead and add, why don't we just go ahead and add a state as the column filter. I'm sorry, as the column. Actually, I think I have these backwards from how I'd like to have them. Let's swap these. I'm going to put state down here as the row and label as the column. This is going to be a little bit better to read. So now we've got our states down here. So now when I look at this number here, this arson number, where'd that arson number go? Oh, here it is, first one. So what does that number mean? In the whole data set, there are 2 arsons reported at all schools that are in the state of Alabama. So we can, of course, bring on another value into our row labels. So not just looking at state, but I'd also like to have information here about the school. And then even when we've got multiple schools, I'd like to split that out by campus. So for my rows, I've got state, school, and campus. And these look, I don't think I really want this all collapsed or all expanded out to start with. So let me just go ahead and choose, right click on one of these university names, one of these school names. I'll choose expand collapse and collapse entire field. So that should collapse all of the universities down. So I've got just a list of universities. And I may do that same thing for the state as well. So right click it, expand collapse, collapse entire field. Okay, so now I'm kind of back to what it looked like before I added campus and school, but now I can expand up any particular school that I want and drill into whatever campus I'm interested in looking at. Looks like University of Connecticut's got a couple of campuses, and we can see those detailed numbers. Finally, what I'd like to do is bring in the report year as a filter. So I'll just bring report year down here as a filter, and by default it's all, but I could say, you know what, I'm really interested in looking just at the 2010 numbers here. And so now I'm looking just at 2010. I've got the data split out here. It's really quite a nice table. Okay, questions? How many of you, just kind of show me how many hours that would have taken you to do on your own? If I kind of said, build this, if you're less than an hour, give me 0. If you're 1 to 2 hours, show me a 1. Just kind of show your comfort level. You could just, how comfortable are you with this? 5 would be, this had taken me half a day to do. 0 is I kind of built this table really quickly. Maybe somewhere around an hour, 1. Okay, so looks like most of us are saying this is something I could have done pretty good. So that's good to know that you're pretty comfortable with these. All right, so I think this is, in fact, maybe let's do this. Let's go ahead and say, you know what, maybe our real interest here is, we're going to be comparing Utah with maybe a couple of other Mountain West states. So Wyoming, Mountain West. Who else is a Mountain West state? We'll just do 3. New Mexico is not far off here. New Mexico. So we're gonna default this thing to be everything collapsed down except for New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. We'll have those expanded out as the starting point for this pivot table. All right, so I think I'm ready to throw that one out and start recording. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that one. And come to my developer tab, turn on my macro recorder, and I'll just call this build pivot table. Store it in this workbook. I don't know, capital T for a hotkey. I don't know if we'll be making it that often, but it wouldn't hurt to have a hotkey on it. Okay, so I'm just going to go through that same process. Insert a pivot table. Put it onto a new sheet. That sounds great. And I'll just do these pretty quickly this time, bringing my value down here. For my column, I'm going to want the label. For the rows, I'm going to bring in the state, then the school, then the campus. I'm going to go ahead and collapse those two levels. So I'm going to right-click one of the colleges, expand collapse, collapse entire field. And then the same thing for the state. Expand, collapse, collapse entire field. And then I'll just go open up those three: Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Stop recording. Now, if we were to just try to run that macro that we made just now, it would fail. And it's because it's going to be expecting to be dealing things with sheet 2. It's going to try to make a sheet called sheet 2. So let's go ahead and look through this code, try to understand what it's done, get our feeling for the objects. We're going to try to simplify the code because, as a general rule, when we start recording more complex things in Excel, the code that gets generated is needlessly verbose. And so once we understand what's going on, we should be able to clean things up and make it much more readable. So let's go ahead and come to our code window. Alt F11. Looks like I got rid of my Project Explorer. And I'll also bring up my properties window. All right, so here's my module 1. I've got a build pivot table macro here. So let's just kind of take a look at it. I mean, just kind of generally looking at this code, it looks like a lot to digest. So let's just kind of go through it statement by statement. We'll clean it up as we go. All right, so here we have range 10. I'm selecting range D10. We don't need that. We just need to look at the pivot caches for just a moment. Thinking about it's creating a pivot cache here, and it's creating this pivot cache because I deleted that other pivot table. Okay, first thing to realize, let's probably talk about this before we start diving into this code. There's two objects that we're dealing with. Kind of like when we're dealing with charts, we're dealing with a shape object that holds the chart. When we're dealing with pivot tables, we have a thing called a pivot cache that we never really work with, but there's never an object that we work with a pivot cache when we're interacting directly with Excel. But here's the idea. The idea is that, well, first of all, when I build a pivot table, the source for the data does not have to, I mean, the data that I'm analyzing does not have to be in Excel. How many of you have ever built a pivot table in Excel where you're saying, don't look at Excel for the data, but go out like to a database or to a text file to get the data? Anyone done that? It looks like one or two of us has ever done that. But it's pretty common to say, listen, I've got some database out there that's got the data that's kind of continually being updated, and that's what I want to organize. And so, and I may want to build 2 or 3 or 4 different pivot tables off of that same data. And so that's the idea behind a pivot cache. It says, listen, let's get the data organized into a way that it's ready to have data to have pivot tables built on it. So regardless of whether the data sits here in Excel or if I'm bringing it in from some external source, step 1 is to say, let's get that data into a pivot cache, essentially ready to make pivot tables off of. If I then say I want to build another pivot table off the same data, it's not going to build a different pivot cache. It's going to say, I've got that data there, and I'll build multiple pivot tables off the same pivot cache. And so let's take a look at like this statement here, and we'll look, we'll be able to see then here, that's then we're seeing the create method of the pivot caches collection. So I would expect that my active workbook pivot caches should have just one. If I create a pivot table off of more than one data source, then I will get a pivot cache for each one of those. Yes. We should have stopped recording the macro. So yeah, and we're not doing anything on the screen on the workbook. So you haven't recorded anything that you didn't mean to record by being over here. So I think you're just fine. But tackling that pivot cache is something we're gonna have to tackle head on. We're gonna have to think about that expressly. Because you'll notice here, it is saying, hey, we're gonna create a pivot cache. And when we run our code, we don't want to create a pivot cache every time if we're building it on the same data set. Okay, but I see, cut copy mode, we don't need, that select we don't need. So let's go ahead and we'll just get rid of those. And so here's the first one that looks interesting. We're adding a sheet. Now, after it adds that sheet, it's gonna get added with a particular name, and the macro recorder has now done the rest of our code by saying, oh, you must be talking about sheet 2. No, we're not. We're talking about whatever sheet we just created. So how am I going to keep track of whichever sheet I just created? Any thoughts? Go ahead. Yes, make an object variable, and because when this sheet gets added, it's going to pass back a reference to the sheet that was just added. Just need to capture it. So dim s as a worksheet, and then set s equal to sheets.add. So now anywhere I'm saying sheet 2, I can just say sheet, or just say s when we get there, and that'll just be a reference to whatever sheet was just created. All right. So now active workbook. With our active workbook here, I think I want to change this to this workbook. And that would depend on really what am I trying to accomplish here. Am I writing a tool that as long as I have this workbook open, I can build pivot tables in other workbooks? But I think I want to think of this as having, this is the workbook that has the data that I'm after. So let's change this to be this workbook. Pivot caches.create. Okay, and let's take a look at this statement. This is a long, long statement. So pivot caches.create, here's the opening parenthesis that says we are going to give several arguments to the create method to tell it how to create. And then here's the closing parenthesis. So there's the end of the create method right up to here. And then what is this after that? Dot create pivot table. Someone talk to me about that. What is going on there? It's so strange. Pivot table or pivot caches dot create dot pivot table dot create pivot table. It's something pretty similar to what was happening here with the sheets dot add. So someone just tell me, hey, why is it that I can say dot create pivot table after this? Go ahead.
Because the create created the cache. Now you're putting a pivot table out of that cache.
That's exactly right. The create here creates a pivot cache and returns a reference to the pivot cache that just got created. So this statement builds the pivot cache and then says, here's the memory address where that pivot cache was, where we built it. And all we're doing with it here is we're saying, well, all we really want to do with that pivot cache is build a pivot table on it. But we're going to need to be a little more sophisticated about that because we need to see if that pivot cache already exists. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break my statement here onto a different line. It's going to make the second half of this statement invalid. First half invalid as well. But let's now say dim PC as a pivot cache. And let's also over here dim PT as a pivot table. And so now we are going to set PC, our pivot cache, equal to the pivot cache that we're creating here. And then down here where it's saying, oh, we're going to call, right? We used to call the create pivot table method on what this returned, like directly by putting the dot pivot table, create pivot table here. But now we're saying, hey, capture that in an object. Remember where that object is in memory. So what are we going to do here? We're going to say PC dot create. I'll bring that up onto the same line. But just like when I say create for this pivot cache, it's going to pass back a reference to the cache. When I call this create pivot table method, it's going to pass back a reference to the pivot table that got created. It would be nice to capture a reference to that object as well. And so because I'm going to be doing something with the return value that comes back from this method, I've got to put the arguments in parentheses around these arguments. And then I will be able to say in front of this set PT equal to create the pivot table. Okay. And now we've got some other work to kind of clean things up here. So the first thing is, it looks like it's like figured out that we're on the crime data sheet and we're looking for like the range that has the full set of data. Now, quite often in VBA, when we're referring to a range, we can either give it a string representation of that range, or we can give it an object representation of that range. Like we could actually write a statement that identifies the whole object, and we can pass that. And that's the case here for source data. So source data doesn't have to be a string. It can take an object. And so I'd like to modify this code so that when I run it, it will just take anything that's on the active sheet, like the data set that's on the active sheet. Or maybe we'll use the crime data sheet. Crime data sheet is actually called, it's got an object name of data, as we can see right over here. So maybe we'll refer to it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this. And how might I be able to say, you know, hey, what I want to do here is just take the data that's on that data sheet. I'll get us started. Data, that's the name of the worksheet. DATA, right? I should be able to come up here and say data.name, and it should tell me the name of that worksheet. That's called, like on the tab, it says crime data, but the object name is data. So any thoughts on how we could say, select the data that we want for the pivot table? Or don't we have to get the whole thing? Like just tell me one method that might be useful for this. Yes. Oh, good. So used range, I don't know that we've talked about it much, was probably in the chapter on dealing with ranges. But right, there's a method called used ranged. Used range. Returns the range it returns the smallest rectangle that contains all the data on the worksheet. And so I should be able to ask for the address of that range, and it'll tell me A1 to G23,164. So right, so data.usedRange should get the data, should be the source data for the pivot table that I'm creating. Now, let's tackle the issue of having multiple pivot caches. And just to simplify our code here, we're going to assume that if there is a pivot cache in this workbook, that it is the pivot cache that we're after. So if we're going to be building, if we had lots of different data sets and we could have several different pivot tables built on different data sources, we need to make this code a little bit more sophisticated. But for today, let's just say, hey, if there is a pivot cache, use it. If not, let's create it and then use it. So I think before we dive in and create this pivot cache, let's ask ourselves if there is a pivot cache. How do I ask if there's a pivot cache? If, then, else, and if. So I really want to find out if there already is a pivot cache I just want to use it. Otherwise, let's build it. Anyone want to take a stab at this one here? Go ahead.
If I just do pivot cache dot count, that's equal to 0, double count.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We're just going to look at the pivot. We're going to say, hey, look at the pivot caches in this workbook. We'll look at the count method. And we want to know if that is greater than 0. So if it's greater than 0, well, I guess we could leave it as 0. If it's equal to 0, and then that's when I want to create the pivot cache. Otherwise, I think I just want to bind onto the first pivot cache there. So if there's already a pivot cache, then we're going to set our pivot cache equal to, oops, this workbook.pivotcaches.item sub 1. So now when we run this, we're going to say, hey, listen, if there's no pivot caches, create one and bind our pivot cache variable onto it. If there is one, here we're just assuming that the first one is the one that we're after. And again, we could make the logic a little more complex to check to see which of all the, we can write a loop and loop across and find out which one had the range we're after and use that. But here, we're focusing more on the pivot table than the pivot cache. But this at least lets us tackle that idea about realizing we've got to address the issue of whether we're going to create a pivot cache or use an existing one. All right. Questions? How comfortable are we with what we've covered so far with pivot caches? 5, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5. Okay, good. Okay, so now whether we've created a new pivot cache, we're using the existing one, we're ready to create a pivot table. The destination now is hard-coded to be sheet 2. So we could either do this as a range, or I bet this one will take a reference to a cell as well. So let's just go ahead, instead of saying sheet 2, I'm going to say S, our worksheet variable, dot range and row 3, column 1. Row 3, column 1. Column 1 is A, row 3 is 3, so that's going to be A3. I definitely don't want to name it pivot table 2, but my guess is if I don't tell it what to name the pivot table, it will probably give it a name anyway. And if I was to hard-code a name in here, I'd be worried about having a collision the next time it makes a pivot table. I think it's probably going to build an adequate name without it. And then I bet I don't have to put the default version in there either. But let's just go ahead. We've done a few changes here. Probably a good idea to run to this point and see what we've got. So I'm going to put a stop in here, and I'm going to run this procedure. Ooh, it made a sheet 3, and it put a pivot table on there. Hasn't configured it yet at all, but so far so good. We should be able to see how many, let's see, got sheet 2 and sheet 3. So if it created the pivot table, I'm going to have 2 pivot tables. My guess is it did not create it, and hopefully it didn't create it, and we've got just the one here. Yeah, so we still have just the one. So that means it must have come through here and used the existing one. In fact, you come and step through here just to see it. Yeah, it's coming through and binding onto the existing pivot table, pivot cache, building the pivot table. All right. Question?
So you could create multiple pivot tables for the same cache.
So the question is, so you could create multiple pivot tables on the same pivot cache, and the answer is yes. It's exactly what we have here. Because I've got this pivot table that we recorded ourselves making, and then I've got this pivot table here that we just ran the code to generate. And you're right, we have just one pivot cache here. And that's the idea. So yeah, that pivot cache has organized that data in such a way. I mean, it's taking up some memory to do that. In fact, taking up a pretty good chunk of memory to do that because it's got all the data in it from that we're working with. I think may route to it. I'm not sure if it's actually copied it or not. But that one object now we can create multiple pivot tables off. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look then at the rest of what our code is doing. Okay, so it's selecting the sheet. So we're saying, hey, we need to select the sheet, but the truth is, folks, when we add the sheet, it is going to be the active sheet. And we haven't done anything to change that, so we do not need to select this. I'm going to get rid of this one as well. I don't think we need to select that cell either. So it recorded that cell getting selected because that's where the pivot table got built. But there's nothing special about that being active when the pivot table gets built. I'm going to get rid of the selecting as well. Okay. So now we've got a long block of how we've configured like this pivot table. Column grand. So does it have a grand total column? It has auto format. So the truth, folks, is that all of these are the default. It is just recorded like the default settings for the pivot table. This is really nice because it shows us, hey, what do we have to do if we wanted to change some of these defaults here? But if we don't want to change the defaults, if like just coming up with a default was fine, we don't need this block at all. I'm just going to look over these really quickly and see if there's anything that I think I would want to change about it. Display field captions, true. See, all this stuff is great. I'm going to, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to cut this. And maybe I'll just like open up Notepad and I'm going to paste it into Notepad just in case, you know, I think, you know what, I'd like to change the look of this. I've got these sitting here, and if I kind of get done with this example and I don't want to revisit any of these, I'll feel fine just letting that code go. I can always record it again to generate it again. All right. So this then seems to be the first activity that we're really doing. Oh no, let's see. With active, so what are we doing here? So this is the with end with. This just gives a shorthand notation that says, hey, we're going to do a bunch of things with whatever object is identified here. And this is doing something with the pivot cache that belongs to the pivot table 2 pivot table on the active sheet. So how could we simplify that statement with how we've done our code so far? What could we replace the highlighted portion with? Yeah, PC. Because this is saying, listen, the active sheet's got a collection of pivot tables. It's got a pivot table called pivot table 2, and that has a pivot cache. Well, it had to have that long statement because it didn't pay attention to the pivot cache that got created, but we did. We captured it in this PC variable. And so without really taking a look at what it's doing, just realize that we could say, just change that to PC. And what this is saying is refresh on file open is false. And it's setting up it's like it's setting up a couple of defaults here as well. I'm going to do the same thing with these. You know what? I'm going to pull these over and just kind of put them in my file of where all code comes to die, just in case I want to resurrect it. It'll make the resurrection process much easier if it's here. But that's setting a default on the pivot cache, and I think I'm going to let it be whatever the default was. All right, let's tackle the next one. Active sheet, pivot tables, pivot table 2. What does this get to? Yeah, that gets to our pivot table, but we captured that pivot table when we created it, so we can change that to PT. Repeat all labels, Excel repeat labels. Again, this looks like it's a default. I'm going to leave this. It's kind of small. I'm going to leave this in place. Maybe we'll comment it out and see if it makes it look like anything is different as we get there. So here again, active sheet, pivot tables 2, or pivot table 2. I'm going to change that to PT. Add data field. Finally, something that it looks like we actually have to do. So we're going to add a data field. And which field are we going to make the data field of our pivot table? And it says down here, it is pivot field value. It's the value. So it's looking, this is really kind of ugly. But right here, it's saying, listen, we've got a collection of pivot fields in this pivot table. And there's one called value. That's the one that I want to make the data field. How is it identifying the pivot table? That same kind of long statement to get to the pivot table. So I'm going to change that to PT. Pivot fields value. So that's getting me to that pivot field. And I'm giving it a sum of value. Sum of value, where does that go? Sum of value. That's what goes right here. Is that what I want to have it say there? Sum of value? I don't really like sum of value so much. So I don't know what I should change that to. I'm going to call it university crime. And Excel sum, I do want it to be summing the data. So that's saying what kind of aggregation are we going to put on the data. Okay. And so now it's saying what kind of field is it going to be? Is it going to be a column field or a row field? And if I look at these, it's putting these in position 1, position 2, position 3. So these are the ones I'm putting on the row, right? This is the state, school, and campus that was coming in as the row. I don't think I really need to specify the position. It's got to have some position. So I think it's going to go in the order that they're entered. So if I don't need to address 2 properties, there's no reason for me to use the width here. So I should be able to simplify this quite a bit as well. So instead of that to get to my pivot table, I'll just say PT. And then instead of width, I'll just bring my orientation up onto that line and get rid of the width statement. So now we're doing 2 things here. We're saying, listen, we've got a pivot field called value. And that's the one that we're going to turn into our summarization in our data field. Now we're going to make a column field out of our pivot field called label. So we're saying, take that pivot field and make it a column header. And let's do the next 3 together because they're really similar to this one. So I may even just copy pivot tables. And so I'm going to make the state into a row field. And then I'll do the same thing with school and campus. And so again, I'm capturing this part of the code, but I don't have to specify the position because I'm not trying to like put the position somewhere that it would go by default. They're going to go first one first, second one, and then third one. So I can simplify that as well. So it looks like we're selecting A6, selecting A5. I can't imagine that those need to be selected. I'm going to delete that selection. Here's the next one that I'm interested in. And this is saying, look at our pivot table. This is the show detail where we say not to show the detail for that field. So we're going to need that one as well. So again, I'm going to simplify the reference to the pivot table, PT. And the pivot field called school, we're not going to show the detail. Same thing on our state. Active window, small scroll down, 21. I don't think we need to scroll, so I'm going to get rid of the scroll. And so now it looks like we're specifically, let's see, active sheet, pivot table, pivot select. So we're selecting Wyoming. Okay, so I'm not really quite sure exactly what this is doing, but let's go ahead and simplify what we know to simplify. I'm going to change the reference to the pivot table down to PT. I'm going to bring this up onto one line. So I'm going to get rid of the underscore. Okay, so this is selecting Wyoming. And then it's giving this argument, Excel data and label, plus first row is true. So the true must mean to show it. But XL data and label and first row. So these are constants. So this is just telling it something about how that's going to be selected. It's modifying how the selection is happening in that pivot table. Just going to print these two things out. These are just numbers. That's 0 and 256. And so when we add those together, that's just telling this pivot select method something about how to select it. And I'm just fine to accept that's going to, I expect that to select it the same way that we did it when we recorded. So even though I don't really know what this is doing in here, I'm okay with that code the way it is. And it looks like we've got 3 of these, right? So we should have the one for, well, let's look at this next one. It's not, let's look at this, what this next one is. Again, same thing here. I'm going to simplify what I can. There's the reference to the pivot table, change that to PT. And bring this up onto one line. So state, pivot items, Wyoming, show detail is true. I really don't know what this is doing. Let's leave it in for now. And I think after we get it working, we'll play with it and see what we can take out. But it looks like we've got that same thing happening for the other 2 that we selected. So let's do that same simplification on these. Pivot table. Show detail. Pivot table. So it looks like we have 3 lines here that are similar that don't have this other pivot select. Truth is, I don't remember ever seeing that in the recorder in like prior times I've done this example. We've been through the code and we've done what we wanted that to do. I think I'll leave the stop on here. Maybe what I'll do is move my stop up so we can kind of watch it go through all of this. So I'm going to put my code off to the side so we can watch it build. All right. I'm going to go ahead and delete both of my existing pivot table sheets. I think that will have gotten, since I no longer have any pivot tables that depend on the pivot cache that those were on, it should have deleted that pivot cache as well. So if I ask how many pivot caches I have now, it should be 0. So now it's going to come through and create the pivot cache as we go through. So I'm going to go ahead and run this code. And then we'll step through it with F8. Yep, it's building the pivot cache. Now we've got the sheet built already. We're putting the pivot table onto that sheet. And again, that's like a setting. I'm not sure what that's doing. This one is putting the value in there. We see it do the value. Next, we'll put the column field on. Our different crimes. Now we'll add in the state. school, campus. We'll collapse the school. We'll collapse the state. Pivot select. What did that do? Looks like it just selected that row. I'm not sure we need to do that at all. We'll run through and actually expand Wyoming, expand Utah, and we'll expand New Mexico. So yeah, I think at this point, I'm ready to get rid of the part that's selecting that part of the pivot table. I don't really need it selected for any reason. This repeat labels has got to be defaults again. I'll take that one out. And take a look at the code now. So now we've got our code down to a much more manageable set of code compared to what that was when we first looked at it. In fact, it all fits on one screen here. We're declaring a few variables, building a sheet, making the pivot cache if we need to, and then setting up that pivot table the way that we need it set up. And we should be able to run that again. Control Shift, what was it? T? Yeah, I'll just continue to generate those as many times as I want. Okay, questions on what we've done so far with pivot tables? Somehow the recording must have gotten easier than it was in years past, because I've now told you everything I want to tell you about recording and editing pivot tables with VBA. And we've got like 25 minutes to go. I'm not opposed to letting you out 25 minutes early, but I want to make you feel like you're getting your money's worth out of this class. So any other questions? Anything you'd like to see done differently with this pivot table? If later you change your mind about that question, record yourself doing it and seeing it. You've got you have now the main things that it takes to understand how to manipulate pivot tables through code. All right, if you have questions, come on down and see me individually. Otherwise, thanks for coming. I'll see you on, what is today? Today is Wednesday. I'll see you next Monday. Class dismissed.